As noted in the previous lesson, what we're going to do here is talk about Raphael Lemkin and the creation of the word genocide, the motivations that Lemkin had in creating genocide as a concept, the sort of inspiration, and also something quite important, which was his own personal definition of genocide, or what at least he believed should be included as either a protected group or an act that would be constitutive of an active genocide. And it'll be interesting to bear that in mind when we look at this in comparison to looking at the final result, the result that is ultimately the Genocide Convention, and examine why, in some circumstances, Raphael Lemkin isn't too happy with the definition of genocide as elucidated by the convention itself. So we're going to examine the Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin and the events which led to him coining the term genocide. And as a basic introduction, Raphael Lemkin lived between 1900 and 1959, so he died at quite a young age, as it turns out. He was a Jewish lawyer, a Polish Jewish lawyer, who is widely regarded as the sort of intellectual architect behind the development of the concept of genocide, and he is one of the most ardent and most forceful and vocal advocates for the definition of genocide to be codified in international law. He was someone who very much wanted genocide to be on the indictments in the Nuremberg trials. He failed in that endeavor, which we will get to. But he ultimately gets his comeuppance because he ultimately gets, or he gets his success, should I say, because he ultimately gets the codification of genocide into international law to the point where genocide is now one of the most important and well-studied areas of international law to this day. His efforts to define and criminalize genocide were driven by his personal experiences, the atrocities of his time, and his belief in the international legal system. And his belief specifically in the recognition that the international legal system needed to address the systematic destruction of groups, recognizing the victims of genocide, or the victims of these mass atrocities, are not victims of those mass atrocities necessarily because they are individuals who the perpetrators believed have wronged them in some way, but because they belong to a group. Now, this is quite an interesting distinction, and it's a distinction that really sees the diverging paths between genocide and crimes against humanity, between Lemkin and Lauterpacht, and something that is spoken about at great length by Philippe Sands in his book East-West Street, because he's talking about the fact that there is a distinction here. Lemkin believed that the value, or at least the key point at which victims of genocide are actually perpetrated is because they belong to a group. Whereas Lauterpacht believed more in the view that there should be the human rights and the protections of people as individuals, okay, and that we should prosecute people on the basis of the crimes they commit against individuals, not necessarily because they are committing against particular groups. And so that is the sort of distinction between crimes against humanity and genocide, even though they could be constitutive of the same acts. The same acts could be theoretically both a crime against humanity and genocide. He was born in a small village in modern-day Belarus, which was then a part of the British Empire, the Russian Empire, should I say. He grew up in a Jewish family, and his early exposure was to that of cultural and religious diversity, as well as ethnic tension. All of this develops into his understanding of the importance of multiculturalism, the importance of rich cultural distinctions and divergences among groups of people, among people of different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, national identities, etc., etc. So that's sort of a background and a biography to Raphael Lemkin himself. Let's now think about his early advocacy. How did he advocate for the recognition of such crimes in international law in his early days? Well, one of the things that is important initially is when he was a young lawyer, he was troubled by the fact that international law seems to be silent on the question of state-led mass atrocities, the prevention and punishment of state-led mass atrocities. You would be surprised to find out that during the Second World War and prior to the Second World War, international law said very little about what a state did within their own territory in relation to their population, torture, the killing of individuals, all of which were considered in most circumstances, in most jurisdictions, crimes in a domestic sense, but were not considered crimes in international law. International law was very silent on all of these different things. And so in the early 1930s, as a public prosecutor in Poland, he began to articulate his ideas about the need for there to be such international frameworks, a framework that is responsible internationally for the addressing and prosecution of such heinous crimes. Now, he was particularly disturbed by the assassinations of Armenians, the killings of Armenians by the Ottoman government, as well as all of the sort of events that take place in that regard that went unpunished during the First World War. In 1933, he would present a paper to the then sort of international global order at the time, the League of Nations, at a conference in Madrid, advocating for a law that would be able to prohibit the destruction of ethnic, religious, and social groups. So a sort of proto understanding of genocide at the time that was introduced in 1933 at the League of Nations. He called for international legal action against what he described at the time as barbarity, the destruction of groups through murder, and vandalism, the destruction of cultural heritage. And it is this point that I want you to really keep in mind when thinking about this further, because it is this point that is really important when we think about what Lemkin's definition of genocide looked like. Lemkin's definition of genocide included this idea of cultural heritage, this idea of cultural destruction, something that is not present in the Genocide Convention. His ideas were met with resistance, of course, many states reluctant to impose any restrictions on their own sovereign governments. Essentially, if it's within our territory, if it's within our borders, then it's none of your business, essentially. And so the idea of transcending sovereignty, transcending the sovereign borders of states, was something that was very much rejected by a great number of states at the time in 1933. But then this all would change as the result of the Second World War. The Second World War made it very clear that such frameworks for responsibility for international crimes was necessary. Okay, regardless of if genocide would be included in that list, war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, all of which were necessary for the second, for as a result of the Second World War, essentially. So, one of the things that you would know if you studied the Second World War, and you should probably intuitively understand if you hadn't, is this idea that the Third Reich didn't just come into power in 1933, 1934, and then start the Holocaust immediately. There is conflicting interpretations historically about when the Holocaust begins, but there is consensus that the Holocaust, at least the persecution of minorities in Europe by Nazi Germany, takes place as a sort of gradient. It starts out relatively small, the stripping of certain civil liberties, the requirement of certain things like the abolition of marriage between Jews and non-Jews with the Nuremberg laws in 1935, and then we start to see things like the Reichskristallnacht in 1938, the Night of Broken Glass. And then you start to get, after the end of peace, essentially the beginning of the Second World War, you start to see the ghettoization of Jews in places like Poland, the Einsatzgruppen squads that then go and start committing acts of murder in the Soviet Union. And then the sort of final solution, the plan to exterminate Jews in Europe through the use of death camps, only really comes to fruition with the Wannsee Conference in 1942, the start of 1942. So you start to see that there's a growing sense of persecution that eventually culminates in the genocide that we know of, that is the Holocaust. When the Nazi forces invaded Poland on September the 1st, 1939, Lemkin would flee to the east, eventually making his way to Sweden, and then he would flee westward, shall I say, making his way to Sweden, and then eventually to the United States. He sort of goes up to the United States in 1941. during the Second World War, as there was the extermination of millions of Jews in the Holocaust, what Lemkin saw was a sense of urgency in the development of such addressing of such international crimes or at least the addressing of these crimes at an international level, the prosecution of these individuals for the crimes that are being committed. His family were all killed in the Holocaust, including his parents and many of his relatives. These personal losses would, of course, motivate him even further, and so then you have greater advocacy when it comes to the prevention of further genocides in the future. While in the United States, he began to work as a lecturer at Duke University and later an advisor to the US War Department. This is really where we start to see the meticulous documentation of Nazi atrocities across Europe, the collecting of evidence, and really one of the things that the Nazis, that you could theoretically thank the Nazis for, is the fact that they were meticulous in their documentation of their genocide. The destruction of their evidence was not particularly well done. So when it came to actually collecting this evidence, they really shot themselves in the foot with the amount of meticulous detail that they went to when it came to the liquidation of ghettos, when it came to the numbers of Jews who were transferred from one part of the continent to the other, the number of Jews that were documented going into and out of these death camps, places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, such that even though we don't know the names of every person that died in the Holocaust, unfortunately, or even though we don't know the true scale of some of the acts that take place during the Holocaust, we know we know that these people existed, and that's what's valuable to people who are going to then prosecute these individuals for these crimes. I remember when I went to Auschwitz to visit, we went to a sort of a photography representation of the Holocaust, and there was one of the pictures that really resonated with me the most was just a picture of a field. It was just a general field, and it looked completely untoward. And then if you read the little caption, it tells you that the picture represents the place where one of the death camps was. It was, I believe, Belzec, one of the death camps. And this is where around 250,000 people were murdered, and systematically exterminated. And it places a sort of sense of scale that this is just a field, and in this field, because the Nazis ultimately destroyed as much as they could the evidence of this particular death camp. A similar thing could be seen when you look at Treblinka, for example, where it's just, I believe, a bit of railway track that is left, and you think, well, this is a place where 250,000 people, the majority of which we don't know their names, we don't know their lives, we don't know their ambitions, their dreams, their hopes, were all exterminated. And it was sort of like they were wiped off the map. And in that sense, that is genocide essentially defined to its most systematic point. This is, if there is any definition of genocide, it is that. And so that's something that always resonated with me when thinking about the Holocaust, and when thinking about genocide, and when thinking about international justice and international law. Let's move on. Let's talk about the book that was written in 1944, which is a book by Lemkin, titled Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. Lemkin recognized there was no legal term to describe the systematic destruction of entire groups. Winston Churchill himself defined it as a crime without a name. And so, of course, if there is no word to define the crime, it would be difficult to prosecute the crime, the nameless crime in international law. And so he coined the term in 1944, genocide. The book documented policies of occupation by Nazi Germany and other Axis powers, as well as the racial extermination policies that we, at least at the time, knew of. Now, the knowledge of the Holocaust is something of a controversial issue when it comes to how much the Allies knew about the Holocaust at the time. I believe that as we get to the sort of 1943 and onwards, probably even earlier than that, that it was pretty conclusive that we knew that something of a grand and quite extensive scale of murder and mass atrocity was being committed. The question then is, how do you deal with that situation? There was a lot of controversy in relation to how the Allies would actually deal with that. I believe there were plans to potentially bomb places like Auschwitz, where we knew that something like this was taking place, but this would be the sort of arguments against that were that taking resources away from the war effort would essentially prolong the conflict itself and would result in more people being killed in the long run, in addition to the fact that bombing railway tracks is pretty useless, given that they can just rebuild them very, very quickly, and bombing Auschwitz itself would lead to a lot of civilians being killed in the process. So there were probably things that the Allies could have done, and I've not looked into it in too much detail in terms of like the sort of ally plans or what may or may not be able to have been done during the Holocaust. But there are also arguments for why they couldn't have done anything in regards, except for to win the war, to actually do the sacrifice of going through and liberating Europe. Now, Lemkin derived the term genocide by combining the Greek word genos, which meant tribe or race, with the Latin word cida, or side, meaning killing, which we know from the previous lesson. Again, and also should be important to note that the term itself, according to Lemkin, encapsulated both the physical and the cultural destruction of a group. He recognized the importance of cultural significance of a group, not just their physical presence, but also their cultural significance, the impact of multiculturalism and the importance to preserve multiculturalism. The concept of genocide went well beyond, therefore, mass murder. It included measures aimed at the destruction of a group's culture, their livelihood, their viability, such as things like the deportation of children and forced sterilization. And it is here that we get Lemkin's definition. And I want you to keep in mind Lemkin's definition when we start looking at the actual the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide in a future lesson. Because Lemkin defines genocide in two ways. There is this idea of physical genocide, the mass killing or destruction of individuals within the group. And then you have cultural genocide, the destruction of a group's way of life, their institutions, their language, their heritage, their education systems, their history, the destruction of the knowledge that they have of their own cultures. So that should be noted, that it is not just a crime against individuals, but it is a crime against humanity as a whole, because Lemkin believed that humanity benefits from diversity of human cultures, and genocide is the antithesis of that, and fascism is fundamentally the antithesis of that, and Nazism and the Third Reich is an antithesis of diverse cultures, and really seeks to impose a limitation on and a destruction of any other culture or way of life beyond that of fascist ideology, which is why it is obviously a scourge. In continuation of this, Lemkin, after the war, dedicated himself to ensuring that this newly formed United Nations would not ignore him in the same way that the League of Nations previously did, recognizing crimes like genocide as a distinct international crime. He relentlessly lobbied diplomats, political leaders, international organizations to support the idea of codifying genocide as an international crime. So, one of the things that is important to note is that genocide, the idea of genocide, is defined quite starkly in and within the general context and the shadow of the Second World War. Okay, it is defined in the shadow of the Second World War in relation to the Holocaust and the atrocities committed therein. That does not mean, therefore, that, by contrast, that genocide requires a Holocaust-like event taking place in order for it to be considered genocide. We will get to that in future lessons' time, as you will probably understand, but that would be a particularly high standard if that were the case. And so, as a result of which, we see that genocide almost takes the spirit of the Holocaust, the general idea of the Holocaust, the systematic destruction of groups, and elucidates that as a generalized principle within international law.